This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
So menopause, it's really nature shutting down reproduction.
It's the most natural transition and we're supposed to go through it. It's the suffering that women experience across that transition that's not okay.
The main thing to know about perimenopause is that it's temporary.
Stress has a huge implication on the symptoms around perimenopause.
The messages we get day to day is that youth is power, but actually wisdom, that's power to me.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the healing journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? In Season 2 of The Shift, we explore the intricate world of women's health and help you discover how to balance your hormones and understand yourself better so that you can truly thrive.
The menstrual cycle is a vital sign of female well-being.
My mum just used to say, "Oh, Nan, I'm so sorry. It's part of being a woman."
I would like a call to arms for women to know that their intuition isn't lying to them.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift. When you think of menopause, what comes to mind? My observation is that most women range from a little concerned about this time of their lives to terrified about what might happen to them. They conjure up images of hot flushes, out-of-control moods, and frankly, turning into a crazy person. The truth is that for a lot of women, the perimenopausal years can be a struggle. In fact, I know that there are many of you beautiful women listening to this right now that will be begging for menopause to end so that you can get some relief. Menopause can cause so many symptoms, ranging from mood issues to vaginal dryness, to loss of libido, to night sweats, insomnia, weight gain, fatigue, and so much more. For some women, these symptoms can be so debilitating that they lose their sense of self and can't function the way that they used to anymore. And while it is true that menopause can do all of these things, it is also true that it doesn't have to be this way. It is also true that menopause should be one of the most profound and wonderful transitions that we make in our lives as women, and as we're going to explore, one that should be celebrated. In this episode, I want to look at all of the layers of this conversation. We'll talk about hormones, what happens to your physical body, and the emotions involved. But I'm also going to talk about what it means to transition through this time of your life and become the wise woman, the final stage of the maiden, mother, and crone that we spoke about in earlier episodes. Let's start here with naturopath Lara Bryden, who has recently released a book about menopause called The Hormone Repair Manual, after going through it herself.
The thing that I'm excited about menopause is that I am now completely convinced that it's a normal, natural state and not just the accident of living too long. We've had this narrative that, everyone used to die by 45 and therefore, menopause is just, it's kind of because you've lived too long. And so therefore you've outlived your ovaries. What the research shows now is that that's definitely not the case. In fact, through the lens of evolutionary biology, menopause is something that we've adapted to have. In fact, what the research seems to suggest is that human longevity itself developed so that women could live, 2 or 3 decades after their final reproduction. So we've got this state of post-reproductive vitality that was very important for ancestral humans, which to me is just fascinating. And it just infuses the whole process with a lot more meaning. I think the shift to menopause is a natural state. It should be inherently healthy. The fact that we experience symptoms with menopause is potentially a mismatch between our modern lifestyle and our physiology as it evolved to be. So one of the things that happens with menopause is we lose the higher reproductive amounts of estrogen and progesterone as we do shift to more of a tendency to insulin resistance, which can have a big impact on symptoms of menopause and also long-term outcomes. So one of the most important hormones actually through all of a woman's life is insulin and sensitivity to insulin. So during our reproductive years, having a healthy sensitivity to insulin, having insulin levels that are not too high can support healthy regular ovulation. And then with menopause, having a healthy insulin sensitivity can help to prevent menopausal symptoms to some extent, and also some of the longer term outcomes in terms of cardiovascular health that can be associated with menopause.
I think it's something that a lot of women don't understand. They'll say things along the lines of, it makes me feel really old. And that's heartbreaking because they're not. And it's the most natural transition and we're supposed to go through it. It's the suffering that women experience across that transition that's not okay. There's huge amounts of information in the suffering. It's from the body. So it's helping women to decipher what that is. So is the heat that is so disruptive to their daily lives or to their sleep, is that heat coming from lower levels of estrogen that are supposed to be there, or is it coming because the liver is having a really hard time because of their lifestyle choices? So pulling that apart, just deciphering that, helping them to find answers with that, because obviously if you can go from 25 hot flushes a day to 5 hot flushes a day, it's far more manageable. The sleeplessness, where's that coming from? Is it common things like using backlit devices before bed, or is it the heat still disrupting you with your sleep, or is it that your heart's trying to wake you up to something else that life has to offer you, or that you have to offer life with, a certain part of your life, one chapter finishing and another chapter beginning? Is your heart trying to wake you up to something? And that's why it's racing as you're dropping off to sleep. So it's, I guess, giving women really helpful questions to ask themselves through that, giving them tools to ease that suffering, because as I have said earlier, it's that unnecessary suffering that I hope that this type of work makes a difference too.
That was Dr. Libby Weaver, nutritional biochemist, author and researcher. So what actually happens in the process of menopause? Essentially, as Lara Bryden mentioned, it's the natural process of shutting down your reproductive function. From a hormonal level, you stop producing the estrogen and progesterone that you used to while you were cycling, and the decline in these hormones are what lead to many of the health consequences. Dr. Felice Gersh is an integrative obstetrician and gynecologist from California who's been working with women for over 20 years. Here she describes what happens during the transition into menopause.
When you enter menopause, I consider it like entering retirement. So if you are looking ahead and you're very thoughtful, you will save for your retirement. So when you hit retirement and you say, I'm not working anymore, although that's not going to be me because I don't retire, but for other people, they look at their bank account and they say, oh, look, I've saved for my retirement years. And other people say, I have no money. I'm broke. So they're not going to fare so well. So that's like women when they hit menopause. The way that they've lived their life up to that point is like saving for those menopausal years. So I liken it to like you go through the pre-menopausal years, the reproductive years. You're like an airplane with 2 engines. Okay, then you hit the perimenopause, one of the engines goes out. Then you hit full-blown menopause and both engines of your plane are out. So if you have done well, like you've eaten the right foods, you've gotten plenty of sleep, you weren't on birth control pills or similars for most of your reproductive years, you have plenty of bone, you have good muscle, your brain is working really well. So you hit menopause and you've really been healthy all your life. Then when your last engine on your plane goes out, it turns into a glider. And you actually glide through the rest of your life. You go down, because you can't stay at the same level. You're not going to be the same person as you age, but you're going down slowly, gradually. But if you have led a terrible life, and this is what's now become the norm, you've spent most of your life on birth control pills, you haven't built up the bone, the muscle, your gut is a mess, it's been a mess for years. So once you hit menopause, you get dysbiosis because you lose your estrogen, but you already have dysbiosis because you've been, living on birth control pills and eating poorly and chemicals and processed food. So you hit menopause and your plane engines go out, you go into a nosedive. And that's what I'm seeing. Women going into a nosedive. They rapidly develop metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, then diabetes. They gain weight like crazy. They have emotional problems, headaches, sleep problems. Like every menopausal symptom is really exacerbated because they don't have the reserve, because they weren't really in great shape when they hit the menopause years. And that's really a huge problem. So in women who have lived really healthy lives, and they continue to eat foods that are filled with polyphenols and antioxidants, because menopause creates an inflammatory state. Because you get the dysbiotic gut microbiome, leaky gut, you're going to have increase in inflammation. And just like with women with PCOS, when you don't have enough estrogen, you become more inflamed because your immune cells become more hyperreactive at a lower threshold. And we know that estrogen works with the glucose transporter system. So when you don't have enough estrogen, you innately will become insulin resistant. By the way, NAC is great for women in menopause too, because it helps with glucose transport. So women in menopause have all of these metabolic problems, but when they live a healthy life, when they are getting exercise and sleep, and they have emotional support and love and friendship and purpose, and they eat lots of polyphenols, we know that there's miracle plants. I call them like miracles, like phytoestrogens, that if they're eating like organic whole soy and flaxseed and plants that have lots of fiber, they help to keep their gut microbiome as healthy as possible. They help trigger the estrogen receptors in the gut using the plant-based phytoestrogens. They stay healthier. So today, most of the women hitting menopause are not healthy to begin with. Most of them are already overweight before they even hit menopause. And they're not very fit because we have a sedentary society. So they need the most help they can. So menopause being natural doesn't mean it's naturally beneficial. It's really nature shutting down reproduction. But once you understand that estrogen is the hormonal glue between metabolic function and health and reproductive health, that when you lose reproductive health and you lose your peripheral estrogen production, your metabolic health is going to decline too. So it's really a question of what kind of a decline. Is it a nosedive or is it a gradual glider kind of going down slowly? So my goal is to try to make everyone stay away from the nosedive. So I have to look at each woman individually, and I discuss hormone therapy, what it can and can't do. No matter how I give hormones, I'm not replacing the ovaries. The ovaries are unique. The ovaries make hormones in a very purposeful way. It puts it out in pulses throughout the day. You have the lunar rhythm, the 28-day menstrual cycle. You have rhythms through the 24 hours, like there's more estrogen produced in the morning than at night, and it comes out in pulses. It doesn't come out in a blob in the morning or as a patch all day long. So no matter what I do, I can't truly replicate the ovarian function. I don't have that capability. So it's never going to be the same. So what I'm trying to do is really soften the blow, all the different negative things of menopause. And I look at it this way. If you think of health as a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, then all the hormones, and includes all of them, the estrogen, the testosterone, the thyroid, the cortisol, all the different hormones make up the 400 centerpieces. Then the peripheral 600, that's all lifestyle. So you have to keep your puzzle from disintegrating. As you have these puzzles, and where did that piece go? It's hiding under the sofa, never to be found again. So somehow pieces of your puzzle as you age seem to disappear. So my goal is to keep as many of those 1,000-piece puzzles in the puzzle. So I have to focus on lifestyle. That's the 600 pieces around the periphery. But the 400 in the center are also vital. If you lose all your 400 center pieces, you're not going to see the picture very well. So I have to make sure that thyroid is working properly. And I always discuss, and most women I recommend, but not universally, I recommend to consider having some bioidentical hormone therapy, not to replace the ovaries. I wish I could do that. I wish I could have a new pair myself, but to try to soften the blow of losing that critical hormone estrogen and its sidekick progesterone. And testosterone goes down as well, separately from the menopause. And in fact, as women go through the transition, sometimes their testosterone level actually rises because LH increases. Just like in PCOS women, the ovaries are not producing enough estrogen, and the brain says, more please, and it puts out more LH, so you make more testosterone, but it doesn't get converted into estrogen. So sometimes women during the transition years, they get terrible problems with acne. They say, what the heck is this? I'm like 48 and now I'm getting acne. It's because of their increase in LH. So sometimes testosterone is something that could be replaced, but not always. It's not universal, but it's something to look at and also discuss. So menopause is really a natural but not healthy It's not healthy for any woman. No woman goes into menopause and then goes into the healthiest state of her life. It's never going to be that way. It's a question of what are the consequences for that woman based on her own desires and the condition that she is when she gets into menopause.
If you need a reset, please join me for my free 7-day health reset challenge that is coming up very soon. In this challenge, I'm going to be guiding you through some really simple but powerful changes. You'll get a workbook, recipes, and so much more to make your shift. Go to theshiftclinic.com/links to register. Once we move through menopause, as women, we're more susceptible to many conditions, such as cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, and dementia. Our stroke risk increases, and we also have an increased tendency to anxiety and depression. But although these issues are more common, many women do not experience these at all. So what is the secret? It comes down to the state of your endocrine health and also the health of the rest of your body. For those of us that already have imbalance, menopause can be like a pressure cooker, and the changes in hormones can be enough to express an issue that was lying beneath the surface. Brain health is a huge area that we need to look out for as we age. Dr. Nicola Gates is a clinical neuropsychologist, researcher, and author of the book, The Feel-Good Guide to Menopause. I wanted to ask her about the changes that happen in our brains during perimenopause.
Okay, so if we just step back a minute, the brains of men and women use estrogen. So estrogen is crucial to quite a few brain and functions, including mood, but also, for example, memory formation. So much so that there's research now suggesting that if there's not enough circulating estrogen, the brain will actually create its own. So it'll do some enzyme conversions and so forth and get its own estrogen. So all brains have estrogen. And that's important because one of the things that happens post-menopause is that women end up having the same type of estrogen as men and the same-ish levels as men. Some people suggest we end up having less estrogen than men post-menopause. So there's all these body changes going on which impact upstairs to the brain, but there's also changes upstairs in the brain that impact on the body. So some of the things that women report, apart, is obviously like sleep disturbance, and that's because the change in estrogen affects the circadian rhythm, the body clock. But also women report brain fog and forgetting, and that's because estrogen has a role to play in memory. And I have to put the caveat around this because, the research investigating this is A, there's not much of it, and B, it's very new. So women by the medical body have really been treated as sort of sub-men. And most medical research until recently was all on male animals and men. And it's only recently, and when I say recently, we're talking mid-1990s, that it was determined that we actually needed to look at studies of women only. And because of that, changes are only just beginning to be understood. Before I came on today, I've got research alerts and I just downloaded another article and it was looking at the differences between men and women and neurocognitive disorders like dementia because of gonadal sex. Now, I'm talking about gonadal sex and the sex gonads are ovaries and testes. I'm not talking about gender identity. I'm talking about gonadal sex. It makes a difference because that determines your lifetime exposure to certain hormones and how they have a huge impact in utero, early development, then through our teens. And obviously, as we age, the differences between men and women decrease with age. So at perimenopause, the brain, there are changes happening in the amount of estrogen and progesterone coming from the ovaries, and that means there's less circulating estrogen overall, but also there's a transition in the type of estrogen available. And that just means that women can have some cognitive symptoms, which I've mentioned. But the other thing that can happen is, because they are brain-related, changes in mood. And that's because those, and they were considered sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, both impact women's mental health because, for example, they reduce stress and anxiety and depression. And when they go down, women can become more vulnerable to mental health issues, particularly if they've already had a mental health issue. Now, at the risk of continuing, if we just step back a bit and think about why all this happens, and I guess this is the influence of my dad looking at evolution, my question is always, what is it that's driven these things to happen? And if you think about what needs to happen for reproduction, and that's, all species have evolved for reproduction, whether you have kids or not is irrelevant. We've evolved to reproduce. So for women, they need to obviously ovulate, and then they need to hold a baby, and then they need to give birth to the baby. So we have these hormones that support all of that at a physiological level. So we have eggs and we have a uterus. So we have all the parts. And the other thing that needs to match those is our mental state. And so if you understand, Mother Nature's going to say, well, if someone's going to get pregnant, we need to make sure they're not too stressed and anxious, because that's not a really good environment to become pregnant in, because it creates inflammation and it's a huge burden. So what we're going to do is when a woman's pregnant, that's particularly progesterone, so we get estrogen has a role at the beginning of the cycle, because, if you've got mental health issues, you don't really feel like having sex, do you? To put quite bluntly. So when we're ovulating, we go, let's help women feel a bit more positive, because if they're not positive, they're not going to have sex. If they don't have sex, they're not going to have babies. So we have estrogen to help with mood. And then when we get an embryo, so when the egg's fertilized and is locking into the uterus, progesterone goes out. Obviously, the estrogen gets turned off and we have progesterone, and the body's going, well, we've got to keep this little baby. So we need to make sure that the mum doesn't have a lot of stress, and progesterone has a role in turning down the stress. So that's the evolutionary basis to why those two things affect women's mental health. There's a reason for them. Make sense? And so when we go through perimenopause and those two things start changing and we're getting less of them, or they're cycling erratically, then women can find that they get snappy for no reason. They become homicidal and want to kill their family for no reason. And I say that because women have written and told me that. I've had emails from women saying, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Now I understand why I was homicidal. And they kind of go, this is not like me. I was never stressed like this. The kids laughing annoys me. I was never like this. And that's because our stress tolerance has changed. Our stress levels have gone down. We perhaps get more anxious. Maybe we're a little anxious, but now we find we're getting more anxious. We get more worried. We might feel a bit more depressed or a bit more down. It's all perfectly understandable in the context of perimenopause and menopause.
Earlier in the series, you heard from naturopath Dr. Lara Bryden about the beneficial effects of our hormones during our menstruating years. We're going to revisit this concept here and talk about what it means for us once we cease menstruation and enter into menopause.
We need to ovulate every month because that's how we make estrogen and progesterone, which we need for general health, not just to make a baby. I mean, the other way to make those hormones, of course, is with a pregnancy. But in our modern world, most of us are not going to have 10 pregnancies through our life. Instead, we're going to have about 400 periods on average, 400 monthly cycles of making hormones. And with those hormones, we're building up metabolic reserve. So each and every ovulatory cycle, each and every dose of estrogen and progesterone builds health. It builds bone density. It builds cardiovascular health. It builds brain health. It's good for mood. I think of it like each and every ovulatory cycle is like a deposit into the bank account of long-term health that we can then draw on for the rest of our lives, even after menopause and we stop having menstrual cycles. We know from the research that women who have natural menstrual cycles through their life are likely to live longer. That's just coming out now. There was a research at the end of 2020, the British Medical Journal, looking at that. And there could be different reasons for it, but I think one way to interpret that information is that the hormones themselves, estrogen and progesterone, that we make with our menstrual cycles are beneficial for long-term health. Estrogen, for example, improves insulin sensitivity, so it helps to prevent insulin resistance. Both hormones are very good for cardiovascular health. So that's one of my key messages to women, is that this is something we need to do to be healthy in the long term and also to be healthy in the short term, because Our hormones are beneficial for short-term health effects like mood, even though I know hormones have the reputation of being bad for mood, but that's not the case. Both estrogen and progesterone have a mood-enhancing effect if we're able to respond to them properly.
When you enter perimenopause, things can change. This was the experience of Julie, a member of the Shift Clinic. I spoke with Julie about her experience in navigating menopause, how it made her feel, and how seeing one of our naturopaths helped her to navigate this time. Hopefully, by sharing Julie's story, it might help you to navigate your journey too.
I've always had good health. At different times of the year, maybe some hay fever or some eczema, but really no big issues whatsoever. Until I got to about my mid-40s, and I had very regular periods, and all of a sudden I had this very big period with a lot of pain and then basically nothing. And I thought, this can't be me going into menopause. I thought, it's just, all of a sudden it's going to be irregular. And then I started with the hot flushes and the night sweats. And I honestly put up with that for a very long period of time, thinking, well, this is what it's going to be. I remember going to the GP and they said, look, really, there's nothing we can do because we don't do hormone replacement therapy anymore. So it's just something that you'll have. So I remember talking to friends, mums, and they're saying, that's early, but it can take a long time. It could be 10 years or 15 years. And I remember thinking, oh, goodness. And I have a busy job and I just wasn't sleeping at night. I would get 30 minutes of sleep and then I'd have this night sweat. It would wake me up. It would take me another hour to fall back to sleep. The heat would wake me up. I'd be awake again. And I just thought, I really have to do something about this. I remember just feeling so hopeful that there would be something that could change. And so that's what I did. I attended a number of appointments. The first appointment, we talked about other symptoms of menopause. And I think Nicole gave me a list of those symptoms. And I remember going through and saying, yes, 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 yes. So all these things that were happening to my body, and I didn't realise that it was because of that. Then we talked about a whole lot of other things. So diet, exercise, sleeping, all of those things. And I guess that through that journey of attending appointments, there's been a multifaceted approach to that. So one of the things I noticed early on is I was starting to put on weight. And I've worked with people who've gone through menopause, and it just seemed inevitable that I would get to a stage where I would be putting on weight because it was something that happens with menopause. And I was always disturbed by that. But when it started happening to me, I thought, well, I can't do anything about that. So now I feel hopeful and not worried about it and, calm, because there are things that you can be doing, and so that you're feeling good, but you're also looking good. Because I think that when you are working in, your vocation, you do have to feel confident, you have to feel comfortable, and how you look on the outside, but also how you feel on the inside is a big part of that. When I first came along and started, I would have given myself a score of about 2 out of 10. And now I probably feel that I'm about an 8 out of 10. And I would say, to your point that it's a journey, at times I've felt a 10 out of 10. At times I might have felt a 6 out of 10, because I see that there are different phases and different symptoms that come and go. And so it's important to have that continuing treatment so that you can adjust and respond to what those different issues are. So at times, constipation has become a bigger issue. And so, we've focused treatment on that. At times, it's been, my thinking and my busy head, as Rebecca would call it, the monkey brain. And so there's been need to focus on that as part of the treatment. So yeah, definitely a journey, but huge improvement along that journey.
It can seem like menopause will never end, but as Julie mentions, there is a light at the end of the tunnel and symptom improvement is possible. I'd suggest seeing a naturopath, integrative or functional medical practitioner, or of course one of our team at Shift for support during this time. Perimenopause is the period where your hormones are changing and ovarian function is slowing down. But it isn't until you haven't had a period for a full 12 months that you would be considered menopausal. It can be a turbulent time health-wise, as these transitions can cause huge upsets to how we feel day to day. So how long are we in this perimenopausal in-between state? Here's Dr. Lara Bryden again.
Perimenopause, which is anywhere from 2 to 10 to even sometimes 12 years before periods stop, can start as early as women's late 30s. So yes, women in their mid to late 30s need to know that perimenopause could be soon. And it's not something that's off in some distant future. It's pretty common at least by our early 40s to be noticing some changes with our menstrual cycles. So often, the onset of sometimes, for example, heavier periods or worsened premenstrual mood symptoms. A lot of that's to do with the way we start to lose progesterone first before we lose estrogen. Progesterone is the precious hormone, right? It's the one that we really only make for a couple of decades if we're lucky. So progesterone is the hormone that is a little bit slower to come online as we're calibrating our menstrual cycles, maturing our menstrual cycles when we first get them as a teenager. Those first couple of years of menstruating for most girls are anovulatory, so estrogen only and no progesterone. And that's why girls can have quite heavy periods, can have migraines. Those are all signs that there's estrogen, but not a lot of progesterone. And so as the menstrual cycle matures, progesterone comes online. So ovulation is stronger, ovulation is more regular. Ovulation is the only way to make progesterone. Women start to get more progesterone into their late teens and 20s. And then they're at their peak. They have what's called a robust menstrual cycle, which is a strong luteal phase, lots of progesterone. And that should hold them, hopefully, through the years of, might be some pregnancies in there. And then by our late 30s, early 40s, progesterone starts to drop. It's why I call perimenopause second puberty. Our ovaries are still pretty active. They're making as much, if not usually more estrogen than they have throughout the rest of our reproductive years, but progesterone starts to lessen. And that's why during perimenopause or second puberty, we can start to get heavier periods, worsening premenstrual mood symptoms, premenstrual migraines coming back, maybe hormonal migraines that women might not have seen since they were a teenager. That starts to come back. It really is a second puberty in a very big sense of the word. And yeah, it's important to know that that's coming. It's another argument, another reason to cycle while you can. Have as many healthy ovulatory natural menstrual cycles through your 20s and 30s as you can, because those are really the only ones you're going to have in your life. And that's when you have an opportunity to build up that metabolic reserve that progesterone gives.
So how do we know if we're in perimenopause or not? If you're in the zone, usually between the ages of 45 to 55, you may notice some things begin to change. As Dr. Bryden said, it could be feeling like you're going through puberty again. You could notice changes in your menstrual cycle. They could be shorter, longer, heavier, or lighter. You could notice pain for the first time in years or begin to get PMS. Perhaps you're feeling more warm or getting some night sweats. As you enter into your perimenopausal period, your hormones will change, and this is easily picked up on a blood test. The tricky thing is that this does not happen all at once, and if you don't know what you're looking for or you test at the wrong time, you could end up misdiagnosed like many of our patients. If you test your hormones in the early stages of perimenopause, two things will show up. Your follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, will begin to creep up first. This is why I recommend my patients have a hormonal panel on day 2 of their menstrual cycle every 6 months or so when they're in this age bracket, so that we can monitor for early changes. The second unusual thing that is worth knowing about is that sometimes before your estrogen levels decline, they actually increase, sort of like they're having one last hurrah. The patterns of estrogen can be irregular in some women, and increases can lead to symptoms like painful breasts and heavy periods, or even flooding in some women. Eventually though, as your FSH gets higher and higher, ovulation will become impaired and eventually cease altogether. This leads to your baseline estrogen decreasing as the production from the ovaries slows down. At Shift, we'd usually like to do more comprehensive hormonal testing at this stage. We often will use a Dutch urinary profile or salivary hormones to establish the total estrogen pool, but also how it's being metabolised. We want your estrogen to be metabolising what is called the protective 2-hydroxy pathway predominantly, and not the 4-hydroxy pathway, which has been found to be associated with proliferation of estrogen-dependent cancer cells. Like anything, perimenopause can't be put in a silo, and it's not as simplistic as simply low levels of estrogen or progesterone. We also want to take a look at your adrenal health, as your adrenals are where your residual hormones will now be manufactured. At this time, thyroid issues more commonly crop up, so we want to check out this part of your health too. When you have adrenal or thyroid issues on top of what's going on with your sex hormones, it is a recipe for feeling terrible through this time. There is a lot that can be done to support you, so check in with a functional medical practitioner, naturopath, or another holistic healthcare provider. There is good news, and that is that this won't last forever.
The main thing to know about perimenopause or second puberty is that it's temporary. If you are experiencing mood symptoms or migraines or sleep problems that have come about with perimenopausal changes, then just understand that that's not going to last forever. That's really only going to be until you achieve menopause and then enter the kinder, gentler state of menopause. I think for my own patients, that's been one of the most important things for them to hear, because otherwise you start to panic. You think, okay, I'm old, I'm menopausal now. I'm always going to be popping awake at 3 a.m. I'm always going to be having these new migraines or this new body pain or whatever it is. And that's not the case. What the research shows actually is that most women in their 60s or 70s are the happiest they've ever been. It feels like it's a little bit of a secret that we're, some of us have not been let in on until you actually start to get there. And then you think, oh, wow, this is what's going on. That there can be some very stable, both in terms of health and mood from menopause onwards. That is potentially something to look forward to. And the second puberty, the changes that it takes to get there is something temporary. And even then, the symptoms of perimenopause, even if they turn out to be, as bad as you think or as bad as you've been afraid of that it might be, most perimenopausal symptoms respond very well to simple treatments like diet changes and not cutting alcohol and taking magnesium. These are things that I do with my patients. And for a lot of women, that's enough. There is a place to take some natural hormone therapy, either as progesterone or sometimes estrogen therapy, which is, fortunately, the hormone therapy that's being offered to women with the menopause transition now is natural, what's called body-identical hormone therapy, which is very different than even 20 or 30 years ago when women were being offered pretty horrible drugs, like estrogen-type drugs for that transition. So it's actually now menopausal women have access to natural low-dose hormones. It's women of reproductive age who are being offered horrid drugs in the form of contraceptive drugs.
That was Dr. Lara Bryden again. I spoke earlier about the impact of your total health and how this will help you to transition through your perimenopausal years. Your genetics also play a role, so I asked naturopath and researcher Dr. Robin Murphy what her take on it was.
We definitely see that in addition to genetics, there's a big impact on a number of factors which can affect how susceptible women are to PMS as well as perimenopausal symptoms. So we know that liver function and how well the liver is able to metabolize existing estrogens can be influenced by things such as toxin accumulation. Or often what we'll see is nutrient deficiencies, which will impact liver function to alter how the estrogen pathway is being affected. We also see that there's an interference of certain chemicals with how hormones bind to certain receptors. So this can make women more susceptible as the estrogen lowers to having symptoms of low estrogen. So we see certain heavy metals as well as persistent organic pollutants like pesticides can affect hormone binding. What's really interesting is there's starting to be some revelations around the gut microbiome and what's called the estrobolome, and how this can really impact estrogen metabolism and recycling, and how too high of certain types of bacteria can influence risk of breast cancer. And then finally, very often I see how stress has a huge implication on the symptoms around perimenopause, and women who are susceptible to hot flashes, night sweats, often will address stress and address the circadian rhythm, what people are doing before they go to bed. Are they drinking wine? Are they watching TV? Are they doing work? All of these can influence the quality of sleep, as well as the corticosteroids and glucocorticoids, which can affect estrogen metabolism and kind of shift the body away from reproductive health and hormone production to more, obviously, stress-associated pathways.
I mentioned at the start that for a lot of women, undergoing the transition into menopause can be hugely confronting and emotionally draining. Not only are we often suddenly experiencing new symptoms despite not changing what we do day to day, but it marks a time in our life where we're moving into the next phase of our lives. The topic of age can come up, and for some women, they are really sensitive to the feelings that they are perhaps getting old or no longer in their prime. As Dr. Nicola Gates is a clinical neuropsychologist and a researcher working in this area, I wanted to hear what her take on this was.
One of the things about doing research in this area is age obviously becomes an issue, but the studies have identified that you can actually separate those two factors. So there's the impact of menopause and there's the impact of age. Unfortunately, we grow up in a society where women of a certain age, whether they're in menopause or not, it's the old lady thing. We live in a culture that doesn't celebrate women in a way that they are in other cultures, which is kind of crazy because all the research shows the presence of older women in a young child's life, so I'm thinking of grandmothers in particular, they improve the well-being and survival and health of that child. So, and lots of countries recognise that and are thankful to have older women in society. We don't live in that society. Western societies have put down older women, and this was the messaging around the development of the contraceptive pill and HRT, as it was known at the time, hormone replacement therapy, give you an indication of the idea of women that, if we're no longer seen sexually, we are no longer seen. And so for women going through menopause, there can be a whole lot of issues around identity, that women need to separate youth with identity. Now is the time to put yourself first. Now is the time to realise who you are and what you want, not as a carer, not as a wife, but yourself as a human being. Just because society or even your own family doesn't see you as a person, with a favourite colour or favourite books or favourite music or interests and passions, doesn't need to stop you asserting who you are in a different way. And that's my invitation for women to do. And it doesn't mean that you're no longer caring. It doesn't mean you're no longer a wife or partner. It just means asserting who you are, as well as, and for some it can be instead of, as well as those roles. Otherwise, society won't recognise you and won't see you because you'll fall into the trap of ageism and sexism. Now, the research shows that women who are partnered with someone who isn't transfixed by age and fertility, fertility seen as being sexually attractive, have much better journey through menopause than women who don't have support from their partners. And relationship stress exacerbates menopause symptoms because stress exacerbates menopause symptoms. And, again, I'm so thankful and enriched by the stories of women who I spoke to writing my book. And not all the stories got in my book, but, stories of women who had wonderfully supportive partners. They got the dry vagina, they lost their libido, and their husband said, "That's okay, darling." And to be honest, guess what? So have I. So let's not get caught up in this sex 5 days a week nonsense, because it is a nonsense over a certain age. Mother Nature's not sloppy. Sex libido for men and women does go down with age, and that's because the risks of birth defects and complications goes up, male and female. So Mother Nature turns down libido for both partners, but often men don't acknowledge that. So I've got stories for women who said, their husband said, "Honey, I can snuggle and cuddle, no issue." And then you get the other stories of the reverse, where there's a lot of pressure and partners being unfaithful and starting the second family with a woman 20 years younger than their first wife. So it makes a huge difference. And the reality is, I invite people to review their relationships. Women can put on weight, and this is a lovely story. A woman put on weight, and her partner's male, her husband's response was to say, "Just more of you to love, darling." And then you get body shaming. So our journey is influenced by the people are around us and who we expose ourselves to. A lot of women find their female friendships are where they get life's richness, and they haven't got that friendship in a relationship. And we know relationships change over the lifespan. A good relationship will reduce your risk of morbidity, so illness, and will extend your lifespan. So I guess decrease your mortality, so increase your lifespan. Whereas a relationship that's not supportive and nurturing has the complete opposite effect. And the research shows that women who are partnered tend to live less long than women who are unpartnered. And that's because of the perhaps lack of reciprocity in the amount of caring and nurturing in the relationship. So the women give more, receive less. And the other thing, of course, is that as relationships age, they have this wonderful potential to become more simpatico with age and become more loving and nurturing and develop a much more interpersonal connection than they perhaps were earlier on in the life stage. It doesn't have to happen. But, that is the ideal in a long-term intimate relationship. And humans have kind of evolved to have these long-term relationships. Whereas relationships, they sort of have 3 phases. So there's that initial idolization phase. And then there's what we call the transactional phase. Partnering up can be transactional. So that can be wealth building, career supporting, child raising, animal parenting, or hobby sharing sort of thing, so much more transactional in nature. They tend to go through that as the second stage of relationship. But then they sort of enter this third stage where the joint project part has ended. It's less of the transactional partnership, but more of a joint interest, sort of simpatico, emotional intimacy side of the relationship develops. So spiritual intimacy, emotional intimacy, intellectual intimacy develops in the third phase in later life.
When we're trying to make a shift in our lives, all it can take is one small thing to set us in the right direction. Perhaps for someone it could be listening to this podcast. My hope is to get this into as many ears as possible. So if you know somebody that's stuck and needs to make a shift, why not send them this podcast? It could be the one thing that sets them in the right direction.
The Shift!
Isn't it interesting when you start to look at this research and translate it back to our life choices and how that might impact our health or even our risk of death? After working with thousands of women at the Shift Clinic, we can see the impact of people's relationships with their partners and also their relationships with themselves and how this might impact their landscape. When we look at our sense of self, what it means to be a woman and our sexual self-esteem, there probably isn't a time in our life that rocks us more than menopause. We spoke about this journey of the maiden, mother and the crone that women go through, and I'd like to revisit this now. Here is Kate Reardon, naturopath, intuitive healer and founder of Natural Instinct Wellbeing, talking about these phases.
The first stage is the maiden. It's that virgin energy, that curiosity, that beautiful pureness, that wholeness. It's often depicted in art, in fairy tales, as the princess or the virgin bride or the Snow Whites and the Cinderellas. They're beautiful, untouched, pure beauty that people want to take advantage of and are terrified and want to experience all at the same time. The maiden energy, I always describe it like spring. It's like the butterflies have come out and there's wonder in the air, there's music, there's flowers, there's possibility, there's potential, there is life. There's so much life there. There's also naivety. There's not really knowing. There's not potentially deep trust. The maiden hasn't walked very far along the road. She's still very fresh and very new. She doesn't have all of those life experiences yet. So not that there's not wisdom, but the depths of wisdom aren't full yet. So it's a precious time. It's a beautiful time. It's a flowering bud, that's just blossoming. And you see it when breasts grow, when hips grow, when a woman is really coming of age and their body changes, but their energy changes too. And it's so beautiful. And that's a time when if we don't have support around us, if we don't have that confidence or even just the love and the honoring, it's a time when we start to really contract. 15, 16, 17 is a lot of times when women, for example, their posture changes because they're trying to hide, they hunch over. That's when we see a lot of menstrual disturbances physically start to happen, PCOS, endometriosis, hormonal imbalances. It's because of this lack of appreciation, devotion, and admiration of that particular time that is beyond the body. And this is what's missing in our culture. This is what's not passed down. The next stage is going from the maiden into the mother. So the mother she's a little older, she's a little wiser, she's been through a lot. And the transition that takes us from maiden to mother is childbirth. So you have had life growing inside your body and you have opened yourself to the full capacity of the universe to bring that through your body and out into the world. And it doesn't have to be a human child. And I think this is really, really important to understand because there are many women in life who have chosen not to be a mother or who for some reason cannot be or by life circumstances won't have that option of having a physical child. But the ritual of birth and rebirth happens anyway with so many different things. It could be their business or they're caring for another family. It could be the way that they look after plants. It could be their fur baby. It happens to us. There's a transitional phase where we go from maiden to mother. In that birth phase, and when I talk about birth, I'm talking about the all-encompassing birth of who we are, we have to open so wide that we rediscover everything new about ourselves. And that can be really hard transition to go through because everything we thought we knew was truth has been turned on its head. I know when I first became a mum and I was so ready. I was so ready to have my daughter. I'd had 3 miscarriages before. I'd been through so much of my own soul exploration, of my own physical body, of my own mental and emotional well-being. I feel like every rock that was in my psyche and in my layers of consciousness was turned. And yet when she came through, it completely brought this new part out of me, the mother, that I had never experienced before. And I'm still unfolding this energy. So the mother is the protector. She's the one that holds all of life. She's the one that feels everything. She is the one that you go to for counsel. She is the one that can hold your shadow, that can be with you through the thick jungle of depression, through the most painful suffering. She's the one that's holding your hand while you are breathing and living this life in every facet of it. She's strong. That's when we really find out how strong we are, is in the mother. She is the provider, the carer, the nurturer, the looker afterer on all levels. She's the mother. The next stage a woman goes through is when she becomes the crone, or the elder, or the wise woman. In our Western culture, this isn't honoured because we have lost this respect for our elders. In many other Indigenous cultures and even a lot of Eastern cultures, the wise women, the older people of the village, are absolutely respected, honoured, admired. It is their voice. They have the final say, and that's how it is. We don't have that connection anymore. And so a lot of their wisdom is lost because we think we know better. But they have been on the earth longer. They have seen more, and just by doing more time than us, than that younger generation. For a woman, though, it is particularly potent because that is when you come into your full power. The crone is the woman that doesn't need to apologize anymore. She doesn't need to explain who she is. She walks into a room and everyone knows because she has that essence and that power about her. She can communicate with one look of her eyes and you know what she's saying. She's the queen. And it's not a demanding of power, it's a commanding of power. That inner power that says, this is me and I'm enough. No more pretending, no more bullshit, no more I'm not good enough, no more playing small. This is me and I am enough. I can't wait for the crone stage. I'm like, take me there now. But it's often really challenging for women to get there. And like I said, this is only through elder women that have shared with me and patients that I've sat with, is because it's not honoured. You know, when someone gets married, they're all dressed in white and we lay presents on them and they're so beauty and we look at their beauty and their youth. But when a woman goes through menopause, it's like silenced, it's shamed almost. It's spoken about whispers in the hallway. There's no rejoicing. She's a crone. Oh my goodness, this is amazing. She's in her power. This is what we should be doing. We need to be celebrating women at this stage of life. And without those rituals and those ceremonies, it's really hard for a woman to own that piece of herself. She has to do an enormous amount of inner work to get to that point where she is able to say, this is me and this is who I am, and be naked in her complete acceptance and self-love of herself.
So the next question I had was, why on earth are we so disconnected from the beauty of this transition and the wisdom that it brings?
We're in a youth-obsessed culture and it's an addiction. We're addicted to the youth. We're addicted to things that are young and beautiful. We're addicted to seeing shiny new things that are up and coming. All of a sudden, a lady's wrinkles and saggy boobs and pigmentation and grey hairs, who wants to see that? It's our perception of what beauty is. It's our perception of what power is. A lot of the times, a lot of the messages we get, day to day is that youth is power, but actually wisdom, embodied truth, love, acceptance, wholeness, I mean, that's power to me. If I see a woman that is in that matriarchal transition, heading into her wise woman, heading into the crone, if I see a woman that has finally accepted that she doesn't have to apologize for herself anymore, I just want to bend down and kiss her feet because it is so refreshing. And we've seen these women. They're few and far between, but we've seen them. They're those women that come into the room and you just feel like, oh, I'm going to listen to every single word that she says because there's something about her that's just so tantalizing and desirable. And it's not her looks. It's not her youth. It's not the clothes that she has on her body. It's not the diamonds on her hand. It's her energy. And that is what we need to really, really celebrate. And that's what this whole menopausal period is all about. It's the transition, it's the ritual into owning that part of ourselves. Being a younger woman, I need someone to show me the way. I need those elders to take me through that, to hold my hand, to walk that transition. I don't know how to do that for myself at this point in time. I'm trying every single day. But we need those intergenerational connections to help us understand the full spectrum of the feminine psyche. And this has become even more ingrained in my own quest for understanding it because I'm a mother of 3 daughters and they're still tiny. I mean, my youngest is 8 weeks old and I'm petrified. And so I know that I need to be surrounded by strong, powerful women because I need a legacy of women that are going to show my daughters, not just me. And that's why we need to come together as women. And how do we do that? Through ceremony, through ritual, whatever that looks like. It's not a religious experience. It's a coming together. It's a breaking bread. It's a being together in these intergenerational days, in the old days of the red tent, where we can see, honour, feel, experience, and celebrate all of us in every single stage, not just the youth-obsessed culture that gets all of the microphone and all of the airtime.
I want to have a conversation about what Kate Reardon talks about here, our culture of youth obsession. If you look back to any ancient civilization, the elders were the ones that were most respected, valued, and honoured. Marketers have made billions of dollars off their ability to make women aspire to maintain an unrealistic level of perfection. These so-called imperfections are shamed, and the ideal woman is seen as a prize that we all need to aspire to. Got grey hairs? Better get to the hairdresser. Cellulite? Better go and work on that. Uneven skin? Cover it up with the latest foundation. Breasts too small? Get implants. Lips not full enough? Time to get your monthly fillers injected in. While I am absolutely a fan of celebrating your natural beauty in any way that makes you feel good, many of these procedures, behaviours and beauty regimes come from a place of not enoughness or from worrying about what other people think of us. Imagine if we lived in a world where we were happy in our own skin in all stages of life. Wouldn't that be wonderful? There is a lot of work to be done to change this culture, but it has to start from within. Often by the time we get to menopause, we've had 40 to 50 years of conditioning by society to hate our own bodies. Of course, then the natural progression when you begin to gain a little weight or get grey hairs or sag in places you never used to would be to judge yourself and worry about how others are going to see you in this new way. What if instead we could see these changes as landmarks that show just how far you've come in this life, just how much you've overcome, and how you should be celebrated for the beautiful, wise woman that you are? What I want to leave you with is this. Menopause is a natural transition that marks the end of one era and the beginning of another. With the right support and some good habits, you can make it through this time without it completely ruling your life. If you're listening and you're still in your menstruating years, this is the time to work on your health so that when you reach this point, your transition can be easier. For those that are going through this or are on the other side, know that wise women are the ones that change the world. And there is nothing better than a woman who knows who she is and can stand in her own power. This is what is available to you as you move into the crone. And you need to find other women who are here and model from them what your life can become. A lot of the themes covered here link back to the inequity we experience as women and the disempowerment that occurs as a result of that. In the next and final episode of Season 2 of The Shift, I'm going to do a deep dive on some very confronting yet important themes. I'm going to talk about the systemic suppression of women, the removal of our power, and the inequalities that we experience as women even in this day and age. This is the hardest but most important episode that I've ever had to produce. And we're going to be covering themes around violence against women, patriarchy, and how this has impacted us. And of course, I'm going to set the scene for what we can do to shift this.
Coming up on The Shift.
We're talking about centuries worth of oppression of women.
Every single woman in the world has been told that there's something that they need to change about their body.
As young girls, we're not taught how to say no.
Your apathy allows other men to do it. So don't feel guilty, feel responsible.
And many people still don't believe that coercive control is considered domestic violence.
On its current trajectory, it's going to take us 135.6 years to close the gender gap.
This series is a production of The Shift Clinic. Hosted by Katherine Maslen. Music and sound design by Shade Furlong. Thank you to all of our experts. For more details on them, go to theshiftclinic.com.
We can be. We must be.
The first generation to end extreme poverty.
The generation most determined to fight injustice and inequality.
The generation that saves the planet
from climate change.
And this is how we will get it done.
The global goals.
A 15-year plan for everyone, everywhere.
With no one left behind.
The global goals are a framework that collectively help us
support the health of our people
and the planet.
At Shift, we are ambassadors for the global goals.
This project supports global goal number 6.
Clean water and sanitation.
Every time you listen
to an episode of The Shift,
we provide a day's access to clean water
for a human in need
in Malawi, Africa.
Water is the foundation to health, and we believe
every human should have access
to clean, healthy water.
So please share this podcast wide
and keep tuning in
so we can impact those who need it the most.